Dark Souls Archthrones is a mod created for Dark Souls 3, and people had waited quite a long time for it to actually come out. And we're still technically waiting, as only the demo has been released. But honestly, as far as mods go, it's fantastic. I wouldn't call it Dark Souls 4, but more so Dark Souls Generations, as it feels something like a celebration of the series while having a few of its own twists. Not to mention, I found 18 different bosses to cover in what's supposed to just be a demo, and decided I wanted to do a boss ranking. Two of them actually. First, a difficulty ranking, then a quality ranking a bit later on. Now for this video I'll be including a death counter, but do note a higher death counter doesn't necessarily make for a harder boss, but we'll get into that a bit more later. So anyways, let's get started with the easiest boss of the demo. Just kidding. Before we really get started, I was lying, and we need to talk about Hattie and Skull. So, the issue with this boss is, yeah, it glitched out and completely despawned from the world, so I never really got to beat it, and I can't even rematch it in Quella's Dreams. So yeah, it's just not going to be included on the list. Honestly, though, it was a tough fight and probably would be in the top 5. But since this is essentially a DNF, we just won't count it and we'll move on. Number 17, Aldrich. This fight looks scary, but the only danger here is the game crashing. I'm not kidding, it actually crashed on me twice before I was able to beat this boss. Phase 1 is interesting, as his apostles will begin a ritual to summon Aldrich, and the health bar will slowly fill up. So, if you move quickly and take out the 6 brown-robed apostles, you'll stop the summoning, right? Well, no. You won't be able to stop the summoning, but you can force it to happen early, meaning Aldrich won't have his full health bar. Not that it's gonna make much of a difference with how easy this boss is. Aldrich will summon blobs to assist him, but they barely do anything outside of slow-moving projectiles that you can just hide behind the many pillars in the arena to avoid, and then slash away. Not to mention, whenever Aldrich warps away, they die shortly after. It's definitely one of the longer fights, and if you can't kill the apostles quickly, it's going to be even longer, since I'll have a full health bar. But if you have even a modicum of patience, you should be able to win this fight with little issue. It was honestly surprising how easy this fight was, considering how much of a pain in the ass Aldrich is in the main Dark Souls 3. Number 16, the Karthus Sandworm. The Sandworm is less of a boss and more of a really cool level hazard. As long as you have enough health to not get one shot and have a couple Estus Flasks, you should be able to win easily and snag yourself a Lightning Spear and an Estus Shard. Heck, the boss even leaves halfway through, and you don't need to worry about it after that. Overall, there's not too much to say about it. It's just kind of a little optional boss that's thrown in there because, hey, why not? It's kind of cool. Number 15, the Chaos Amalgamate. This boss gets above the previous two because its damage was high enough to actually kill me, and yes, in the early game there is a genuine threat of dying. But after you know about the two-handed slam, you'll expect it, and it's probably never going to hit you again. So just mind the lava pools and everything will be PG. Alternatively, if you really want, you can just come here with a +4 or higher weapon, and you'll stomp the boss in less than 30 seconds. In fact, in the late game with the dream battles, this is one of the best bosses to grind embers against. Number 14, Florian and Jessa. It's actually a really neat optional boss that offers a very good reward for completing an extremely involved quest line, way more than I was expecting from a mod, especially a demo of a mod no less. Anyways, it's your standard fast and slow gank, with Florian being the faster of the two, but he's mostly going to rely on his whip sword and try to keep you at range, still overall being a very elegant fighter. Meanwhile, Jessa, on the other hand, says screw that noise and opts for the beating you in the head with a hammer approach. It's not hard, especially not by the point in the game you face it, But Jessa ends up getting a second phase, should they be the last one alive, and yeah, it's a fun fight. I don't have any major complaints, I think it's a fun reward, and, well, getting to participate in dream battles afterwards is a great way to get better at the bosses and grind embers, so I can't complain. Actually, it's really nice getting to fight some characters in the game without having to kill them and completely fuck up their questline, or having killing them be the end of their questline. Number 13, Saint Klimt. Klimt? Who the fuck cares? When I saw this man start whipping around like Godskin Apostle, I was absolutely terrified, but his moveset has been significantly slowed down for the speed of Dark Souls 3, and it was noticeably simplified as well. He also doesn't read your inputs, which is really nice. And if you remember to get behind him when he starts whipping around, it stops being a threat and becomes free damage. Overall, the first phase of the fight is fine, but it's not difficult, and it's comedically easy to run him around the pillars if you really need that chance to heal. And then we get to half HP with probably the most dramatic phase shift of any boss so far. Klimt will have a cult sacrifice and he'll turn into the One Reborn. At this point it's basically just Aldrich again, but at least Klimt requires you to keep moving instead of just hiding behind a pillar in almost complete safety, thanks to it raining down projectiles instead of firing slow-moving humming projectiles. If you take your time, you'll have no trouble, but at the very least, it's a lot more dynamic than the other bosses so far, and while Phase 2 is fairly easy, it does at least last long enough that you need to pay attention to what you're doing. Number 12, The Great Deep Accursed. And now we have the last of the Cathedral bosses. I was more than a little surprised to beat it on my first try, but also relieved because the run back to this boss would have been a nightmare. Since you're going through not Winter Lanterns, not Cathedral Knights, and not Subspace Emissaries. Okay, actually the Emissaries aren't too bad. But anyways, since it has the moveset for both forms of the Bloodletting Beasts, I was also surprised by how easy this boss is, considering how tough that guy is in Bloodborne. Thankfully, though, it doesn't have the questionable hitboxes to worry about, so you can mostly get underneath him and remain relatively safe unless he gets smart and tries to grab underneath himself. However, I only just barely came away with a victory against this guy due to an unintentional deflection on his head. Not to mention, unlike other bosses, this guy won't just let you camp him out, as it uses both fleeting and cursed range attacks, so bow spam is not the option to go with. Still, even if the Cathedral of the Deep is a spooky area, it's somehow by far the easiest of them. I'm not quite sure how they made that work. Number 11, The Disgraced Knight. So, this fight's a little bit glitchy. I did the boss fight for real thanks to Quayla's Dreams, but it's honestly not that bad if you played Sekiro, since this fight is pretty much just a reskin of Great Shinobi Owl without any major tricks or surprises. Normally, I wouldn't count a glitch against a boss against it, but considering how easy it is to perform, I kinda think it's fair game until it gets patched. Either way, the boss can be tricky, but it's by no means the scary deflect test of the game. Though, I will admit, the glitches do make this fight really amusing, and probably much funnier than it was intended to be. Number 10, Necromancer Obadiah. This boss would have been a lot harder if he had a proper second phase, or at least a noticeably proper second phase. That being said, I can see some challenge if you have lower health, because this boss can juggle your ass like he's a fighting game character, and the Black Flames do pack a serious punch. but when he gets to about 70% HP, he'll summon some skeletons, and that's kind of it for his phase 2. In fact, he actually becomes easier at this point because he becomes a bit more passive. And if you have a +5 weapon, you can just one-shot the skeletons. So you're in very little danger, and I don't know. I'm not sure what the general opinion is on this guy, but I still find this fight fairly easy, even if this is the hardest boss fight in all of Karthus. Because you can just kind of get away with spamming and you'll win. He's not hard at all, and he doesn't even try to dodge your attacks like some of the bosses do. Number 9, Janara One-Eye. I wish this boss played more of a role in the story. She has a cool introduction when you first come to the area, but then you take her out like 5 minutes into Elian Lois. Her first phase is Corrupted Monk, which I find to be one of the easiest fights in the series, so it really wasn't that tough here. And then after the illusion part, which honestly isn't dangerous if you keep moving, she turns into Champion Gundyr, which would be genuinely threatening, but for some reason this fight doesn't seem to be the best program because half her attacks that feel like they should have hit me just don't. And I'm not sure if it's due to some janky hitboxes or if I'm secretly a dodge god. I highly doubt it's the second one. The other thing to note is that Sora can actually help you in this fight, and yeah, he turns a not too hard boss into an even easier fight. In fact, the only reason I even died my first time was because I came in with half health and only 3 Estus flasks. So yeah, not too much to say with this one. It was actually pretty underwhelming. But unlike the previous entries, I can actually see this boss fight being much harder if they ever patch those hitboxes to be more accurate, because I think here they're a little bit too skewed in your favor. Number 8, the Angelic Siege Golem. Now, that death count jumped up quite a bit, didn't it? Yeah, this boss claimed the second most number of lives for me compared to any other fight on this list, but that was more due to me being forced to relearn Dark Souls 3 and also learn Archthrones combat. He has a much larger moveset than you'd expect for the intended first boss, and that's really cool, but he doesn't hit hard at all, which is surprising considering, he's a giant golem. The moveset is complex enough to wear you down over time and keep you on your toes, but this is never a boss where you're just going to die from one mistake. It's more a bunch of little mistakes will wear you down over about 3 to 4 minutes of a fight. At this point, though, I could go back and stomp him without any trouble, and in fact I did to grind embers, but considering it's a boss that actually forces you to learn the mechanics, I do think that's enough to warrant putting it in the top half, considering it did give me much more trouble and I spent more time on it than half the bosses on this list. Number 7, the Angels of Gertrude. I do not like this boss. Cathedral Knights are fun to fight, but having to fight 2 of them at the same time wasn't very fun. Just look at Ordovus. And giving them the ability to teleport is ass. But their stats are meant for fairly early in the game, and thanks to them sharing a health bar, you can just summon Henrietta and have her solo the fight for you. You may consider it cheap to factor in summons for a difficulty ranking, but honestly, if NPC summons are offered for free, I think it's completely fair game to count them, especially in the difficulty ranking, not so much in the quality ranking. I don't like this fight, but thankfully it's one you can cheese out pretty easily. Otherwise, this would probably end up being much more annoying otherwise. Number 6, Commander Esmond, the Omen of the Eclipse. Now we have the hardest boss in the war-torn village, which kind of surprisingly makes it this high up considering this is the first area you have access to. As far as fights go, Commander Esmond is literally just Godfrey, meaning it's one of the hardest bosses from Elden Ring, but also one of the best bosses from Elden Ring. In fact, I think it's the best boss from Elden Ring, but that's for a different story entirely. Thankfully, he has a crippling weakness to fire that not only can damage him, but also has a high chance to stagger him, and that makes it much easier to bring down Commander Esmond. But, surprise, he actually has a second health bar, where he turns into the actual Omen of the Eclipse. This phase does surprisingly low damage, but it is a chaotic enough fight, and with the ability to inflict curse, there is at least some challenge there. It's not as hard, but considering it's a surprise extra phase, I'm kind of okay with it being easier, especially since this is meant to be one of the first major bosses you take on. And it's actually quite a bit of fun to fight, because, well, Godfrey's a great boss, and I always enjoyed fighting the ulcerated tree spirits, even if they are kind of spastic. Number 5, the Demon Vanguard. Now, we have the actual tutorial boss, and much like Vanguard from Demon Souls, you only have one chance to beat it. And you've got to use the gear and items you've obtained in the tutorial area, while managing the resources that you started with, because that's all you've got. If this was a single phase boss, it would have been a bottom tier breeze, but there's just one little issue, and that's, it has a second phase, where it loses its legs, and you think that'd make it easier, but it ends up becoming surrounded by lava, which makes it very easy to take chip damage and just die, because the lava hits extremely hard. And since you're stuck using the default build against this boss, you can very easily find yourself getting one shot if you're not playing as the knight. This makes for a serious challenge. Unless you're archer, then you can just kind of spam it from a distance and it's a joke. But outside of that, yeah, it's tough. Number 4, the Hade Phoenix. This is the second to last boss I faced in my playthrough, and the Phoenix is a really fun and challenging fight, and honestly, if I hadn't leveled up like crazy before taking it on, it probably would have been number 2, if not number 1. Phase 1 is basic enough, and it's a slightly stronger Sanctuary Guardian, but it has enough HP to not die in just 4 or 5 hits, and its speed has been modified to fit with the much faster Dark Souls 3 pace combat, as opposed to the fairly slow Dark Souls 1 pacing. Of course, after defeating Phase 1, you are treated to the coolest phase transition in the game. And after that awesome attack, the boss gets a fair bit tougher. It's going to start unleashing explosions, burning itself up in order to fly into you in a dash attack, and even doing alternate versions of the Sanctuary Guardian combo to just try to catch you off guard. Thankfully, this boss actually has quite a few requirements to even get here in the first place, and you have to even beat other bosses before you can access this fight. So there's a decent chance this will likely be one of the last bosses you face, and you'll have a closer to finished build. Now, that does not mean this fight's easy, but that means you're gonna be prepared for this battle and be about as ready as you can be. Even then, with all that, I still barely scraped by and somehow pulled a victory out of my ass on my 6th attempt. I'm not sure how, but it was satisfying. Number 3, Flynn, Keeper of the Old Gods. Speaking of requirements to get to the Phoenix, we have Flynn. At first, this honestly seems like a glorified NPC boss, but then he starts flipping around and doing Virgil anime slices, and this is just here to let you know, yeah, no, it's not an NPC at all. This is another boss that forced me to learn, like the Siege Golem, but the difference is, Flynn does enough damage to remain a threat no matter how far along you are in the game, and he's going to make sure you've gotten good at parrying. Though unlike a lot of parryable bosses in this series, a single parry won't cut it. Instead, the first parry is just going to slightly knock him offline for a second, and you'll need to get a second parry in order to properly riposte him. In terms of quality, this is probably one of the best bosses in this entire mod. It's anime as hell, but it's awesome, and Flynn's voice is great. But, difficulty-wise, it's one of the toughest, and technically, you don't even win, but you do have to drain him down to 1% HP, so he'll actually get the scripted kill on you, and that way, you'll be able to progress. So I guess this makes it a forced loss boss fight. Ha! I always knew that the Souls series was the JRPG. Number 2. Krimmel, God of Struggle. This was the last boss I faced in my playthrough, and one of the coolest, pun not intended. You need to take out Krimmel as fast as you can, because the more time goes on and the more health he loses, he'll start breaking the ice, allowing the Lois Knights to join him in battle. Of course, this boss also has Radagon's moveset, so taking him out is easier said than done. It's not impossible, it's fairly well done, but it's definitely a challenge. Especially when you realize this is the other boss that has a second health bar. And yes, the phase change is pretty damn cool. And surprise! The second health bar also shows a major phase change when he becomes Krimmel the Profane Deity, and instead of having Radagon's moveset, he starts using an altered version of the Artorias moveset. Thankfully, any Lois Knights that were either still alive in battle or were unsummoned will now change and join you in the battle to take it down Krimmel. So instead of being a gank, it becomes a raid boss, kind of. Though, those Lois Knights may not live very long because Krimmel hits like a freight train. You can also summon Sword to assist you in battle if you've completed his questline, but that's easier said than done. And honestly, Krimmel is both tanky and strong enough that Sword is probably gonna die before the fight ends, so you still have to actually be good. As I mentioned, Krimmel is basically a raid boss, and from what people have said, and from what I've heard, before the patch, this was far and away the hardest fight in the game. But nowadays, I personally found one I found even tougher, and it wasn't even close. Number 1. Silver Knight Captain Erdon. Now, we have a boss with no fancy bells or whistles, taking the trophy of the hardest. Moveset wise, his first phase only really has like 4 attacks, and phase 2 only adds another 2 or so attacks with a flame buff. But he hits like a truck, and despite wielding a large weapon, he has very dangerous combo strings. While he only has 1 health bar, this is still a long fight due to his overall bulk, and more importantly, the fact that you can't farm large Titanite shards until after you kill this boss, so you're probably only going to have like a +4 weapon coming into it. And once the guy starts hunching over like an Outrider Knight, all bets are off. I really hope you've learned to deflect, which was a mechanic they added into this mod from Sekiro, because dodge rolling is going to take too much stamina and you won't have enough chances to fight back. Not very reliable. And if you're a mage build, I'm sorry to say, he's not going to give you time to cast, because you need to face him head on, and this arena is very tiny. Erdon isn't some super fancy multi-stage abomination or super complex battle with some unknowable god. Now, he is the Giga Chad strength build that uses a fire buff, not because he needs the damage, but because it looks cool. And amazingly, it works out perfectly for him, because he killed me almost twice as much as any other boss. That's both hilarious and kind of terrifying. So, shout out to Erdown for finally giving all the strength bros the representation they've been looking for. As it turns out, you don't need fancy powers, you just need a Unga Bunga and you can make your way to the top of a difficulty ranking. And that's all for this boss ranking. Yeah, Archthrones is a lot of fun, and while it's not without its glitches, it's an interesting and a new way to play the game, and it's a game I can highly recommend. I'm honestly impressed by how much effort was put into this mod, and to be completely honest, I think a lot of it's more fun than Garden of Eyes, and it's not even behind a paywall like Garden of Eyes is, so yeah, I think you should totally play it, assuming you have a computer. If you have a console, maybe don't try modifying it, you might just break your console in the process. That's all for now, see you guys in the next video, whenever that is.